Welcome to Art Basel, Miami Beach. This is the last salon of the week. Actually, I'm going to sit down now. This talk is called What Profit? Hybrid Models of Art Spaces. My name is Mary Spirito. I have a nonprofit in Istanbul, New York called Protocinema. And I'm going to ask you guys, I think it's really more interesting to hear people speak in their own voices about what they do, to talk about, who you are, what your space is, and a little bit of background about you, but about your space as well. So Chris, do you want to start? This is Chris Sharp.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Really happy to be here. I am Chris Sharp. I'm a writer and independent curator, originally from San Francisco. I'm now based in Mexico City, where I've been for the past 3 years. And before that, I was in Europe for about 10 years working as an independent curator in numerous venues, institutions, so on and so forth. I moved to Mexico about 3 years ago with basically, it was a quality of life decision, and I was living with the artist Martin Soto Climent, and we decided basically to open an independent space together. For us, it was a way of creating a connection and anchoring ourselves within a specific local scene. It's a tiny space, it's 9 square meters in the middle of Mexico City, and we do mostly solo exhibitions of mid-career emerging artists, kind of mostly European, North American, and some Mexican. So I'll say a bit more as we go on.
Perfect. Stefan Benchoam.
Hi, thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for being here. I'm an artist and exhibition maker by accident. Together with 4 friends about 6 years ago, we opened up Proyectos Ultravioleta in Guatemala City as a space for experimentation as a result of just being quite frankly frustrated with the art scene in Guatemala and not having a place to either experience or share the projects that we were into. So that's when we started in the historic center of Guatemala City with the project. We had no funds, no way to go about it. We had very cheap rent and overhead. We started, and a very limited crowd, so we started selling alcohol in our openings after the opening started, until the point where the alcohol overdid the art exhibitions. Changed the model, did the non-for-profit thing for a while, and then recently we've been trying to be fully independent and self-sufficient, so we've been doing a very hybrid model in the sense that we're doing art fairs internationally to promote the artists that we're working with and promote the projects that we're doing and raise funds to be able to continue to do the stuff that we're into in Guatemala. So I'll start with that.
That's great, thank you. Prem Krishnamurthy.
Hi, and thank you, Mary, and thanks for having us here. I'm Prem Krishnamurthy. As probably I'd imagine is a running thread through all of our biographies, there's kind of a hyphen in between the things that I do. I started about 12 years ago. I started a graphic design studio called Projects in New York with Adam Michaels, and we're a graphic design studio that works primarily with artists, institutions, architects, educational institutions throughout the world on all kinds of projects, from books to identities to websites and exhibition designs. And so it's through kind of a background of being a designer and an exhibition maker in that capacity that I started 3 years ago a space in New York called P! Or P. And this is a space on Broome Street that calls itself, I think in the initial mission statement I wrote, it was a freewheeling combination of a commercial gallery, a project space, and a mom and pop Kunsthalle. So whatever the hell that means is one of the things I do.
Excellent, great, thanks. My first question was, what makes your space hybrid? Do you think you kind of already, do you want to actually talk about that, Stefan?
Sure, I mean...
Do you think your space is hybrid?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, because we're working out of Guatemala, where there's not really a lot of infrastructures for art, we basically have to see how we resolve things all together. I mean, when we first started the project, people were saying all together, like from the very beginning, that we were crazy to try to do something like that in Guatemala. There was no way for it to work. And what we thought is that it was a great opportunity to be working there because you're already like expected to fail. So there's absolutely no pressure, and it's actually
Supportive.
quite
That's really
liberating.
nice,
Yeah. So if you're able to get past that, then it just becomes exciting because you can just do anything and everything, and you're already expected to fail, so what's the loss? And just experimenting and doing things.
Is your space really hybrid?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, I guess, what the whole talk's about. It is kind of by default. It's not like a position that we've necessarily chosen. Basically, what makes us hybrid is that we open the space kind of rather spontaneously, and then we do our projects according to what I consider a very American logic, which is that we don't do the project based on how much money we have. We decide to do a project, and then we find the money. And one of the ways that we've found the money is by participating in art fairs with artists with whom we've already worked or plan on working, or sometimes artists.
But you're not a gallery.
No, we're not a gallery. We don't represent artists. We have no intention of becoming a commercial gallery and kind of doing the work that a gallery does. I often say that we're something like a self-funding Kunsthall in 9 square meters.
Okay, that's complicated, but we'll get to that more. Prem, how are you hybrid? Like, what is this mom and pop Kunsthalle thing?
I'm not so sure. I don't want to be the
What does that mean?
semantic guy on the panel, but I'm not so sure I'm even that into the term hybrid. I mean, it like etymologically, it's like I think it's a mix. It's like a crossbreed between a tame sow and a wild boar. And I think like when I think of hybrids, I think of cars mostly. I guess that there's something by nature. No, but to be serious, I think that I'm actually less interested in the idea of like a hybrid in the sense of being a combination of models than like a kind of definition that's more open-ended, a definition that by necessity can kind of change and evolve and kind of take different forms based on the context and the moment around it, instead of trying to kind of fit it into an existing model of practice or either of commerce or kind of so-called non-commercial practice.
Right, so context seems to be something. Let's talk about the context within which your space evolved, like all the different kind of aspects of it. Chris?
Wow, that's a really good point. And like, obviously, we're all working in 3 very different contexts. I mean, Prem is in New York, where there's this very strong commercial scene, and it's not bad to be a commercial space. I mean, I'm in Mexico City, which has a very complex relationship with the market, where to be commercial or to have any kind of relationship with the market is automatically taboo. Yeah.
What's your context, like really? I mean,
Our context is there's a lot of government support, there's private support, there's support from banks. What else? There's a very strong institutional scene, and then a small, very strong commercial scene. But in general, there is this sense that art should be supported by the government. It's a kind of social thing in Mexico.
and in general, do you think the artists in Mexico City feel like there is enough spaces to show for people to show their work?
Yes and no, but I mean, from my point of view, yes. I mean, Mexico has one of the strongest institutional scenes out of any country in the world. Most people don't know this, but there's something like over 30 institutions where you can see contemporary art in Mexico City. Not all of them have a kind of international level of visibility, but a few do, and then the rest are very local and supportive of local young emerging artists. So that's one of the reasons we don't feel necessarily obliged to engage with the local context in that way.
But if there is a lot of opportunities for local context work to thrive, then it kind of makes sense to bring work in from elsewhere.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Prem, how would you describe the context of the Lower East Side or Manhattan, or what? Or do you think of yourself as being in a more global context?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the kind of art context in New York in one way or another. But I think that I actually would broaden that to say, like, in terms of the context of exhibition spaces and when I started 3.5 years ago, I think that there's still a way in which people, like most spaces are known for a thing. They are known for showing a kind of work that comes from like one area or another. And I guess for me, it was always really important that there are multiple constituencies at play. For example, just on a physical level, where P is located is on Broome Street. Which some people would call the Lower East Side. If you're a gallerist, you call it the Lower East Side. But it's actually also historically Chinatown. And on the same street where you have now, when I moved there was one nonprofit space on the street, except for me. Now there's 6 galleries on the street. But at the same time, you have Chinese businesses that are functioning that have literally no intersection with the gallerists and the art people. And so in my mind, there's not one context, but many.
Are you still doing your press releases in Chinese?
Not anymore, but it's true that for a long time we had our mission statement as a Mad Lib on the window in Chinese and English, and all of our press releases were multilingual.
Stefan, what about your context? Can you tell? We're less familiar with yours.
Yeah, I mean, we, unlike Mexico and unlike New York, we haven't got an institutional context to be working with, and we haven't got a commercial context, so it's basically a free-for-all. We're trying to just do whatever we can. We're, in a good sense of the word, we're hustling. And seeing what we can do. We don't work with any models or any established forums, but in the same way as these guys, we're just trying to do what we can to like encourage a scene. However, what's really interesting about Guatemala is that there's a really rich context and history. Going back from the Mayas, we had a very strong colonial time and era from the Spaniards, and then we had a very dense civil war that started in 1960 officially, in 1954 with a coup from the US and the United Fruit Company, but ended in 1996. There was a lot of bloodshed and a lot of like assassinations and disappearances, and it's a very brutal thing, but at the same time, because of it, there's amazing artists that worked from that context, like Regina Jose Galindo, who continues to do amazing work till today, Aníbal López, Naufu Ramirez Figueroa, so there is really an amazing number of artists given the fact that there's hardly even an art school if you actually look at it.
Is there an art school?
It's a modern art school where it's taboo to talk about contemporary art. So they're teaching technique, but they're not and form, but they're not really teaching about ideas and aesthetics as we know it in a more global realm. So it's quite challenging, but at the same time exciting. Lots to do.
So how do most of the people learn about, have dialogue with contemporary art?
Some of the greatest artists from Guatemala, like Regina Jose and Aníbal López, they are self-taught. You know, they've got a real thirst for art and the arts, and they're just working intuitively. And then they've been able to connect their work with a more international type of conversation. And then there's other artists like Naufus, for example, who he was exiled from Guatemala when he was 5 because his parents were involved in the Civil War. He went with his grandmother to Canada, and so he started there, and he had that influence. He then went to Emily Carr, and then went to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago, so amazing artistic institutions to be learning. But it's just a combination, like a mix of things, you know, and
Are older artists supportive of younger artists? Like, is it a nurturing or a more competitive kind of community?
It's historically been very competitive. However, one of the things that we have been very clear about with Ultravioleta from the very beginning is the language that we use. So we always tried to put in the word collaboration every time that we could in our press release. In Spanish and English, not in Chinese, but just put it every time that we could. And now you hear, like 6 years on, people starting to talk about collaborations all together. So we do try to like change those dynamics as much as we can.
It seems like, you know, we've got, you know, 3 different cities represented here, but we could have chosen not hybrid spaces from many parts of the world. This is something that's going on all over. Do you think that hybrid spaces are sort of a symptom of something bigger that's going on? Maybe you disagree with me. And if you do agree with me, why? Or if you don't agree with me, why not? Yeah, Prem?
I mean, my experience is probably influenced most directly with my experience working in both in Istanbul and in parts of East Asia. But in Istanbul, for example, I think a lot about institutions like SALT, which is an institution that I've worked very closely with from the beginning, which is a nonprofit space, but it's funded by a bank, and it embodies all of these kind of contradictions of the art world. Where does the money come from? How are things funded? The same questions that in any New York nonprofit, it's basically the people buying art at an art fair are the same people who are on the boards of nonprofits, and those things are kind of just part of the ecosystem. And so, in a way, when I think that there is a trend. I remember when I first opened my space, there was a great piece that Ho Hanru wrote in Art Asia Pacific about the fact that in Asia, since you don't have the same nonprofit structures, you have a proliferation of hybrid models, that people who want to run spaces that are experimental need to figure out a kind of another way to deal with them on an economic level, because there isn't a state infrastructure that's going to fund those things. And so for me, not only as a kind of both as a real gesture and as a kind of symbolic gesture, I could have started my space as a nonprofit, but it seemed much more interesting to do what I was doing as an LLC, as a kind of limited liability corporation, because I think that to do that, and to, as an LLC, for example, pay artist honoraria, but as a gallery or as a commercial enterprise, not as a nonprofit, is something that I think is maybe, hopefully a little more irritating.
A little wonky, maybe.
Remind me exactly the question again?
Like, do you think that this sort of
Is a
proliferation
symptom?
of hybrid
Yeah.
models is part of something bigger that's going on in the world? Like, are there hybrid shoe stores? And no, why?
Yeah, I mean, inevitably. I mean, it also depends on the context. I think there's a lot of funding for the arts is collapsing, and especially in Western Europe, I think in England or in Holland, so on and so forth. And I think people are obliged to a certain degree, as in Asia, to kind of develop alternative methods. So I think, yes, to a certain degree, and I think another symptom is that there is the possibility to do things yourself at a very high institutional level. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but it's possible.
Can you expand on that a little bit? What do you mean?
in
You're talking about quality of
I'm
scholarship.
talking about the quality of the presentation. I'm talking about how you communicate, how you document an exhibition, how that exhibition circulates in terms of documentation, so on and so forth. I think it's possible, to make great exhibitions with very little. I mean, which is obviously, Lulu, that's kind of part of our mission, is to kind of, everything about Lulu is related to scale and economy in every sense of the word. Like, we've done exhibitions with kind of major international artists on like a shoestring budget, and in the end, the artists are still very happy. So I think there's something to be said for that. There's something to be said that the kind of means of production are much more distributed. They're not concentrated in certain hands.
Or maybe more efficient.
Yeah, I would say, especially internationally, what we do with Proyectos Ultravioleta, which is rather interesting in terms of economics, is that we operate on the economies of friendship, is what we call it, which is a series of groups and projects and galleries and hybrids, if you want, who seem to collaborate. We think that we can outdo the system by just working together and working from the same place and towards the same direction. And so that's something that we've been doing with a group of friends from primarily Latin America for about 5 years now. And it's just a willingness to collaborate and to see each other, because we've become friends over the years, and try to just be complicit in those friendships and in the work that we do together. So I think that's resulted from, a greater symptomatic thing, which is why all these hybrid spaces are proliferating, which is economy. We were dealing with...
Can I add something?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I think it's... Sorry, were you done with...
Now I'm done. I'm just kidding.
It just occurred to me, and sorry, the question of broader context. One of the things that just occurred to me that's interesting, that maybe we can talk about or maybe not, is the idea that, bear with me for a moment as I try to think this through. At a particular historical moment, let's say most entities, like within a modernist moment in the 1950s, 1960s, corporate entities, nonprofit entities in general, tried to present a unified face they kind of, they assumed a kind of almost like one community, one public to whom they were speaking. And one of the things that's interesting and maybe draws into the context of like these, whether there's a proliferation of hybrid models, is the fact that we, by necessity, have to acknowledge that there are multiple constituencies and multiple communities. So you might function like a kind of gallery in one context, i.e. an art fair, but you may function as a kind of nonprofit-like entity in another context, i.e. in one's home place, versus some other kind of thing, because actually we can kind of fragment out those different communities and speak to them individually. I don't know if that has any relevance at all, but it just kind of occurred to me.
Yeah, I think so. I think we have to wear different suits all the time. I mean, coming from places where we're operating.
But I'm thinking that maybe it's not only about economy. Like when we were talking, we were saying we didn't want to just have a conversation about funding models, that there's something else. Like I think that beyond what the economy is and how you're getting your fundings, that there's something beyond even just creative expression, that your space is your creative act and you're doing it, that this is a time where there's some kind of shift going on, and that maybe it's about audiences, but maybe there's something else, like why you're making a space that's also, you have concerts in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also the fact that how we get the information that we deal with today. Like we're like dealing with so many layers of information and so many interests all together. And so by having this quote-unquote hybrid model, you're able to explore all of those things. You know, we're particularly not just interested in exhibition making, but we're also interested in being a stage for, you know, poetry readings, for lectures, for conversations, for concerts, for performances, for cookouts, for all sorts of things. And as much as the art world tries to like classify and put us in a box, we're always just trying to like go past those like boundaries and barriers and just do whatever we want, really. It's a place of freedom within this country that seems to be like very hard and limiting in a lot of ways. So it's just a way of fighting those systems altogether.
I mean, for us, it's, yeah, we function in a different way. It's funny, to respond to what Prem said a moment ago, I find that the term, I just participated in NADA with Lulu, and I had to use that term a couple times, because people would come up and kind of perplexed.
Which term is this?
Hybrid.
Okay.
People would come up and be like, so what are you guys? And I found myself half the time explaining what Lulu is and what we do, and how we're not traditionally a commercial gallery, what our mission is, so on and so forth. So I guess there is, in a way, it is kind of protean, but I still try and preserve the center, which is the space in Mexico City. And for us, we're, in a way, it's a kind of curatorial project. Like I see Lulu itself, contrary to what Prem said earlier, as a kind of linear group exhibition, by which I mean you could take our entire program over the past couple of years and ideally put it in an institution, and you would have a coherent group exhibition, which is not to say, I'm not qualifying the exhibition as good or bad, I'm just saying it would be coherent. So I see, and the real center of our practice is the craft of exhibition making. I mean, we do talks, we sometimes do other events, but like, I think when you come to Lulu, it's about seeing the show, spending time with it, discussing it. And in that sense, it's a very mediated and considered experience.
I mean, maybe I should make clear too. For me, actually, P is mostly about exhibitions and what happens in that space. I was more talking about how one has to wear these different hats. But I'm curious to ask another question that kind of comes up, which also might be going down the wrong direction. But I'm just curious. Wait, did you say that you started Proyectos Ultravioleta with 3 other people? Are they still involved in it heavily?
Not heavily, no.
And are you doing Lulu with somebody else or alone?
Yeah, I run Lulu with the artist Martin Soto Clement.
Okay. I mean, it's just that in some ways, I'm just wondering whether hybrid in some ways, because that question of authorship, like the fact that Lulu makes exhibitions and thinks about its entire run as a kind of singularly authored thing is actually something that almost no institution could claim.
Exactly.
Because of the number of different competing concerns that are involved in it, whether they're strategic, whether they're financial, whether they're involved with their board, their other constituencies. And so it's actually this question of like very like authorial vision also aka idiosyncrasy, aka whatever, which might be a code word for hybrid, in the sense that it's following, you're interested in music or interested in these particular things, and you have a venue in which you can put them on stage, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I mean, with the exception of a few kind of dictatorial museum directors in contemporary art right now, it's hard. I mean, institutions have certain identities, but it's hard to develop the same kind of identity if there's just like one curator and one director. So that's something I feel like a space like Lulu can do that an institution can't do. It's a very unique position.
I mean, which is why I kind of suggested this in the beginning, but I'm just curious that I wonder whether the question, again, is less about hybrid spaces and more, for better or worse, and I don't want to reduce it purely to personalities, but both of you said you're multiple things. Like you introduced yourself as a writer and a critic and running the space, and you as an artist and exhibition maker, I as a designer and curator. Like that it's less about those spaces per se, or I mean, this may be an oversimplification, and more about a kind of hybrid approach that an individual has to their practice.
Yeah, to general production.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in all of, and in the end, those three different hats are kind of individual hats, but they all inform each other. Like a lot of the artists that we work with are artists that Martin has a close relationship with, or that I've worked with in the past. However, I'd like to say something really quickly, because I don't want Lulu to sound like a vanity project. We're very mindful of the context of the artists that we show. For us, it's very important that whoever we work with is able to produce a kind of friction within the local scene, that the work is somehow legible in the local scene. We're not introducing like aliens, you know, that like just don't translate at all. And this is a kind of job that I think a curatorial, I don't know what the word would be, like team can do together to prevent somebody from going off on their own kind of vanity project tangent. But somehow I feel like we've managed to, you know, kind of produce something that's not being produced and maybe needs to be there in Mexico City. So.
Yeah, which kind of brings us to the aspect of concerns in your community. Like, what are the main concerns, whether it's artistic concerns or otherwise, that are being addressed in your space? Maybe you can do it better because you have this flexibility and multi-facetedness or not, but what are the main concerns you're addressing?
I mean, we're trying to a large extent to deal with the recent history of Guatemala, which is something that's not really addressed in a lot of places. When you start to talk about a war, which is we've still not come to terms with, people tend to entrench themselves into their positions. You know, they're not open to have different conversations about it, and we find art and artistic practices as a great vehicle to get to those situations. And so everything that we're doing, even though we were, same as Lulu, participating in Nada in a way, it's not about becoming a commercial space and selling the work and all of that, but that's means to be able to continue to do these exhibitions that we're interested in. You know, we're trying to reach also, at the same time, reach and create new audiences for the work that we're into, so that it doesn't become a thing about, you know, us and our friends and the concerns that we're mostly dealing with, but also it becomes accessible to a broader audience, whilst trying to stay relevant internationally too, because we're interested in having that multiple like dialogue and like contamination, for lack of a better word, you know, of ideas, you know, bringing people from the outside into Guatemala and sharing that knowledge, and at the same time being able to export that knowledge that's locally being produced there, you know, and we're not only working in the city, but also trying to connect and collaborate with people, which is also interesting throughout Guatemala, you know, because lately, as of the last 5 or 6 years, there's been multiple artistic projects that have been, start to become decentralized within the landscape of Guatemala. And so there's amazing projects happening in Comalapa, which is in you know, one of the departments inside of Guatemala, in Lake Atitlan, in Antigua, in Quetzaltenango. There's really great things happening despite all odds, and it's like, for once, like decentralizing and having a broader conversation in multiple places at the same time. So that's in a way what we're trying to do and what we're trying to harbor.
Are those shows you kind of hear about like because of like email and internet? Or how would you find out about the shows in the nearby cities?
Again, there's not it's not such a big scene altogether. So those of us that are working, especially now, like we're always in communication with one another, and so we're trying to like promote the others and do that effort, as well as also market not only what we're doing, but what every other person is doing in other spaces are doing. We're trying to reinforce those collaborations all together. And so whenever something comes up, we do try to like promote it and take trips or see ways of collaborating and
That's great.
and
Thank
sharing it.
Awesome. Prem, what are the concerns, like issues you're dealing with at B?
I mean, I think that there are a couple of primary concerns. I mean, on the one hand, and perhaps self-reflexively in the context of this panel, we've tended to have a particular interest in, let's say, older practitioners who have had quite polymathic careers, like Brian O'Doherty, the writer who wrote Inside the White Cube, but also is a critic and an artist who has had over 40 solo shows and really was one of the important theorist of the kind of white cube as a hallowed space of exhibition, but at the same time was also practicing as an artist and as a novelist. And so together with Simone Subal, we've mounted shows and projects with him. And so in some ways or Karl Martens, who is an older Dutch graphic designer in his 70s, who has also made a kind of really important body of work that he doesn't even call art, but is a kind of body of monoprints that he's been making since the 1950s. So these people who, in my mind, kind of cross over between disciplines. I think there's also a kind of strong interest in display and the politics of display, because I think that there's an interest in how the kind of actual context in which you make an exhibition and show something influences its reception and its value ultimately. And so how by kind of introducing different parameters into that, you can make the display itself part of the conversation around an artwork instead of ascribing kind of everything to pure artistic autonomy, which I think is kind of the thing that's happened in the last 50 years or so within the discourse around art. And I mean, other than that, it sounds like I think there's an interest in being, you know, one of the best things an artist ever said to me was the artist Sarah Oppenheimer, who's just somebody I've known for a long time, once moved our facade. She once literally doubled our facade and kind of moved it, and we did it illegally, and it was in Chinatown, and so nobody really checked it. And I remember she said to me afterwards, she said, I couldn't have done that in my gallery, and I couldn't have done that in a museum. So like the fact that something about how we function allows artists to do something that's on the edge of their own practice. And actually I use the term artist very loosely because I'm also very interested in working with people who come from electronic music, like Thomas Brinkmann, or people who come from graphic design or architecture or from other kind of discourses. But the idea of doing something that can allow a person a space to work on the edge of their practice is very interesting to me.
Chris, what would you say the main concerns are in Mexico City right now, but also in Lulu?
Well, yeah, the two kind of have to happen together. But I would say Mexico is very particular. It's a lot of the concerns. It tends to be dominated by a very conceptual, socially and politically engaged practice or practices. There's a kind of doxa that art should be a certain way and it should be thought and researched first, almost before it's made. Obviously, there are a number of exceptions to that, but in general, that's the sense I've experienced as a curator, looking at a lot of art, meeting with artists, so on and so forth. So, and more than anything, I feel like there's different competing constituencies in Mexico that are almost ideologues that are trying to impose this kind of monolithic, unified, to go back to what Prem was saying earlier, vision of art or the way it should be. And I think what's really interesting about Mexico right now is that it's opening up. You have more foreigners, more professionals moving in, and I think the scene is becoming much more multiplicitous. Like there's just a lot more. It's able to kind of host a lot of different interests and ways of making art. So I feel like Lulu is trying to occupy this very small niche, which promotes art that is in which there's no gap between form and content. So in other words, artists who think plastically. This means that we show painting, for instance. There are not many places where you can see painting in Mexico. It's weirdly taboo. It's actually, and that's not something that's limited to Mexico. It exists in other parts of Latin America as well. This is not to say that there isn't a lot of painting, but there's just not a very strong discourse around it, and it's kind of frowned upon. So, I mean, there are some things. Another thing we're interested in is working with artists who are kind of at these points in their careers where they're perhaps maybe no longer so fashionable, but the work is really interesting within the context of Mexico City. I'm thinking of like Ian Kerr, for instance, a great artist who's had a lot of visibility in numerous biennials in the last decade, but more recently is not as visible. But his work seemed very relevant to the context of Mexico and Latin America. So these are a number of the different issues that we're working with. But in general, what we're really kind of almost within harmonious to the context of Lulu as a tiny space, we're really interested in kinds of intimacy, mediation, discussion. Almost all of the art we show is handmade. So the hand plays a very important role.
Is that intentional or something you noticed later?
No, it wasn't part of a mission. It's something we noticed later. But yeah, I think it's something that informs the sense of intimacy, this kind of the immediacy of the work, and entering it through a kind of an almost more phenomenological way, as opposed to like something that's more conceptual. So.
Thank you. Can you tell us about your crowdfunding initiative project that you're doing with Art Basel?
Yeah, this is a crowdfunding initiative that we're doing not through Proyectos Ultravioleta, but through NuMu, which is Guatemala's first contemporary art museum, started by Jessica Caire and myself in 2012. Not surprisingly, we didn't have a contemporary art museum, and we've been playing with the idea of starting one. We at first talked to different institutions, tried to getting their support, collectors, curators, and basically nobody was supportive of this. And so after years of thinking about it and conversing about it, we thought of doing an online platform, but then we came about this kiosk where they used to sell eggs in the shape of an egg. It's about 2 meters squared, 2 squared meters. And I would have to say that 3 years on, it's actually, this is our big line, it's one of the most visited institutions in the world per square meter. It's tiny, basically. And through Art Basel, we had the opportunity to apply or to pitch a project, which is a project that we've been working with Alejandro Torun for quite a while now, which is to help support the work of Joaquin Orellana. He's an avant-garde musician from the 60s from Guatemala who started experimenting with electronic music and then found no crowds to support and no technology to be able to support his practice. And so what we're trying to do with quite a sense of urgency is to try to raise funds to help record and preserve his legacy that he's been working for over 50 years.
Is that live now?
It's live now, and you can all support in different ways. There's amazing perks. And also, and this is going to sound like a terrible plug, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it. Wear that hat for now. You can download an app by UBS, and with that, select NuMu, and with that, we'll get $15 for the initiative. They won't ask you for any details, credit cards, nothing. It's just download, donate, and help us preserve the work of this master, Joaquin Orellana, who's unbelievable.
Part of the thing that's so great about all the multiple hybrid things you guys are doing is that it's outside of existing things. Where do you stand on the sort of seemingly increasing professionalization of the art field? Do you think the art field's getting more professional, or is it not? Or
I mean, me personally, again, that depends on the context. I mean, Lulu is a response in part to when I first moved to Mexico City. Like the first 6 months, I encountered all these kind of pop-up, non-curated group shows that were in these kind of random spaces for one night only. and for me, it felt like it wasn't professional enough. I think there are other contexts where perhaps, I mean, you've got like young curators who are in their early 20s, and the level of professionalization is almost bewildering, which seems to kind of preclude the attempts and failures and experiment of different ways of making art. But so yeah, to go back to Lulu, it was kind of this perceived lack of professionalism that made us want to create something that resembles a white cube, and in which you could see these kind of really crafted exhibitions.
You're doing illegal alterations to your storefront. How do you feel about professionalization of art?
It's a very tricky
Your
question.
context is so different, though.
Yeah, it's a very tricky question because I actually, I am on faculty at a curatorial program at the Bard Center for Curatorial Studies, though I have no curatorial degree of my own. I think that it's a very complex question because I'll try to like unpack it and not take more than about 46 seconds. I think that on the one hand, like obviously the art context has grown exponentially over the past couple of decades, which has good things about it. Like it means that there is a way in which there is more accessibility to contemporary art than there's ever been before. There are people who are exposed to it. It's both exceptionally elite and at the same time accessible in certain contexts. And so, but I think that on the other hand, what that's led to is this kind of almost necessity that there are more gatekeepers, that artists, in order to exhibit in certain contexts, have to get an MFA. They have to go into debt and do that. They have to, and similarly curatorially, before the advent of the first curatorial programs, nobody was trained as a curator because there was no training as a curator. You were an art historian, or maybe you were involved in theater, or you were involved in something else, or as an artist, and you started to make exhibitions. Nowadays, there's simply so many people who are making exhibitions that there ends up being like another filter that's necessary. So it's hard because on the one hand, like it's easy for me as somebody who has no kind of professional degrees to say like, it's terrible that, people are going and getting these degrees, but in a way, it's also an exceptional situation to be able to come from a position of non-specialization and be able to make things at a kind of very high level. And I'm aware of that as a kind of privilege that one has. And so I think that it is very contextual in the sense that I remember, I'll just say one anecdote, which is that I probably also at P, and I should mention also David Knowles, who is the director of P with me and has been there for about 3 years, who is also a kind of hybrid person. And, I think that when we've become known for running the space in a very professional way, as making kind of high level of exhibition decisions, also exhibition design decisions in the way of presentation. And I remember one moment when there was an exhibition that I had curated with Karen Quoney from the Verlis Center for Art and Politics, and it was called Post-Speculation, and the entire space was really messy because it was the aftermath of an installation by How Do You Say Yam in African, an installation about race and politics and Ferguson and social media in America, and it left the space in a kind of almost ruin, and then we overlaid an exhibition on top of it, and a good friend who's a curator said like, what's going on here? This is like really messy. It's kind of really like, she was very disturbed by the fact that we had suddenly moved out of the mode of making these precisely kind of curated and kind of displayed exhibitions into something else, and that made me very happy.
Excellent, great. Stefan?
I think context-wise, it's completely different. Yeah. And we're just dealing with like a completely different set of factors in Guatemala, especially having no art schools, no curatorial studies, none of that. And also, what's interesting, and I might tell it as an anecdote, is one of the projects that we did maybe 3 or 4 years ago. We all of a sudden came to the realization that many of the references that for us were like so like common and like known, for example, the work of Duchamp or the work of Felix González Torres or the work of Onkawara and all these like great artists were not necessarily known for our public. So we were completely unprofessional in the sense that we plagiarized and we reconstructed all of the works. It was an exhibition called The Great Master Works of the 20th Century. And we basically reproduced art history in about a week and a half's time. We had a Duchamp's bicycle wheel, we had the telegrams, we had Felix's candy in the end, we had little maquettes by Christo and Jean-Claude, all these great artists. We announced it as an official and real exhibition. People came up who had never come to our space, all dressed up, like big, almost like suits and ties and all of that, and they were really upset when they found out that they were replicas, We got a lot of trouble for that. People asking us to come out with the truth and say what this was all about, whether they were originals or not, when it didn't even matter. And so what we decided to do as means of speaking out was to actually make an auction of the great masterworks of the 20th century and raise some funds for our project. So that's kind of what we do.
That's hilarious. No, that's like the fun, kind of wild part of the art field that's super exciting and attractive. If you were 18 right now, given how professional the art world has become, would you still have gone into art, or what do you think you'd be doing now, if the art world as it is now, when you were a kid, just getting started?
Next question.
Actually, maybe we should check. Are there any questions in the audience, or no? You don't have any questions? Hang on, our friend is coming with a microphone for you.
I am more curious about Guatemala because even if I live in Paris for 15 years and in Dubai now, I come from Ecuador. So I know what you are talking about when you say practically, in other words, there is a very poor platform for culture. But I am trying to imagine more about how is Guatemala. Please explain me. You describe perfectly your situation and the space, and I can define in my own words a kind of real, contemporary, or even post-contemporary place. But what about, because I imagine that you used to have spaces of exhibition, like a kind of galleries, because in Ecuador, for example, there are what they call galleries, but not really engaged with a kind of serious path to arrive not just to Miami in other contexts or to Arco sometimes, but to really follow a line of development that engage the country to, to tell the truth, to better positions. So if the magazines, I wanted to know more about the press, how the press react when you make events, and if there is develop intellectual or intelligence that make right about art, how is it magazines, how is the other things far from your space?
Yeah, press-wise, we had a little bit of press coverage with Ultravioleta at the very beginning, just because it was novelty. And then as we continued with our program, we had less and less press until now we're still sending out press releases to the press, but never expecting and very surprised if they ever write 1 or 2 lines. It's actually quite frustrating in the sense that you do see the editorial lines of these newspapers and magazines complaining about the whole situation in Guatemala and how we have to change everything, and we're at a very critical political point currently as we're dealing with all sorts of corruption. But then when it comes to the cultural editorial lines that they're actually publicizing, we'll have an amazing exhibition that we're incredibly proud to be presenting. And at that same day, they'll be talking about how Barbie has turned 100 years, that same day, So we're not catering to the press. We never expect them to answer to our pleas and to our concerns or to write about us in a way. What we try to do is just a more a grassroots type of approach where we're talking to different people who are interested in what we're doing and trying to get younger people to come and see our exhibitions and get them involved but in a much more direct way. If there's somebody who's got that curiosity and who's into writing, we'll probably try to recommend and put them in touch with somebody else who's a writer and more established. But in terms of platforms for that, there's really none. Yeah, I mean, there's similar to what you were describing in Ecuador. There are some galleries. They claim to be contemporary art galleries, but they're really producing modern art. And the concerns are more to do with like a commercial side or approach to maintaining their business than to actually be involved with the artists at a much deeper level and try to promote their work locally and internationally. Institution-wise, we have a government museum for modern art, but it's kind of dead in a lot of ways. The person who's directing it is not doing such a great job in using the resources that he's got, so it's kind of like at a derive of sorts, the museum itself. Now we have NuMu, but again, it's a very tiny little platform that has like received a lot of like, I would say, praise or recognition internationally, so much more so than locally to the communities that we're dealing with, which is the immediate community of our neighborhood where we operate, which are people who had never been to exhibitions before and who now have a museum there, which is open 24/7, the museum itself. And so they walk and they see the exhibitions and they're confronted and engaging with art that they wouldn't otherwise. But other than that, I mean, it's a very, I would say like a poor scene in terms of infrastructure, but with amazing artists and amazing thinkers contributing historically to wider discourses.
It's on.
You
It's on.
touched on it briefly, but logistically, with representatives from Lower Manhattan, Guatemala, Distrito Federal de Mexico, how about the actual doing business in relation to local ordinances, crime, the ability to operate, hours of operation, pollution, traffic? What about the nuts and bolts of the operation in your venues?
I'll just answer from my perspective very briefly. We have a saying in Guatemala, which is, it's better to say sorry than to ask for permission. So that's basically how we operate.
I think we can officially adopt that expression as well.
Prem, what makes us think that maybe you agree?
Yes.
All right, great.
But I should say one thing, like logistically, Lulu, we don't have opening hours, perhaps unlike you guys. We're only open by appointment. So if you want to come visit us, and the space right now is in Martin's studio. We're actually expanding the space, and we're going to open a storefront at the beginning of next year. But if you want to, you have, there's no sign on the door, so you have to know the door, and you have to make an appointment. So.
And I'll say for the record, we follow all local laws of which we are aware.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, a question on how could you incorporate the collections of existing art collectors that would like to maybe either create a space or partner with an existing hybrid space? What would be your thoughts towards collectors?
Well, of course, I mean, as a hybrid space, and maybe I didn't say this more clearly, I mean, we are a space that sees itself as a mix of a project space and a commercial gallery and this kind of mom and pop Kunsthalle. And so we do work with collectors, we sell artists' work, we work with institutions, and in fact, that's very polemically a reason why we are organized as a commercial gallery, because in our particular moment in time, one of the ways I think to most influence certain aspects of the art context and production is through commercial activity and ultimately through collections, how things are essentially archived for future generations, both within private and public collections, which then creates a record of a particular moment of artistic production and what is or was relevant at that moment. And so I think that that's actually a core part of our activity and why we're organized the way we are.
Do you want to show your collection in one of these spaces?
I mean, for us, we don't sell that much out of our space. Most of our shows aren't even for sale. If we do sell, it's generally in art fairs. I mean, the show we have on right now there's nothing commercial about it. But I think if you want to get involved in these kind of spaces, like go. We don't have that many local collectors who even come to our space. So if you're in Mexico City, definitely stop by.
One more right here, and then we'll, it's getting late, we gotta go, you guys.
It's curious. to me that you do art fairs because they're so expensive. So how do you fund them if you're not really selling out of the shows? Do you have to self-fund them, or does someone kind of like, the fairs help you, do they discount the rates or something? Or?
If you're an official nonprofit, they do discount the rates. We definitely have, we've managed to create a kind of very small operating budget, and we have very low operating costs since the space is currently in Martin's studio, and so we split up the rent. A lot of the time, Martin and I end up paying for things. So, economically, we're not very successful in terms of like self-sustainment, but most of the time when we do art fairs, our general rule is that we only do them if we're invited for free. For instance, we've been invited to participate in the next edition of Art Geneva, which is in Monaco, and the booth is free. We recently participated in Paris International, and we showed a video by a young artist, Chantal Peñalos, like there was barely any money spent. But something like Nada, generally, it's worth paying for a booth, because last year we earned enough money to produce a catalog and run our space for 6 months. So it depends, but generally we try to spend as little money as possible.
Yeah, in terms of Proyectos Ultravioleta, it's ultimately been a gamble in many different moments. With the artists that we started working when we first opened up the space, it was ourselves and a few others. We certainly didn't have the price points to be able to go to and participate in fairs. We tried to, and we had to sell something like 15 works to just come out even out of that, which of course didn't work. Then we were put off by doing art fairs for a while, and then when we decided that we wanted to be self-sustaining and that fairs was the way to go, we actually talked to other friends who had much better price points and incorporated them into the program, which helped in two ways. On the one hand, it allowed us to be able to sell works and make it actually like feasibly economically, but also to help like in a way like validate the work of other lesser known artists, that if they saw them next to the bigger artists, they would automatically assume that they're both really good in terms of quality. And then again, we're always like trying to rig the system in different ways. Like it was actually quite interesting. About 2 years ago, maybe, somebody came up to me and said, like, I love the aesthetics of your booths always in art fairs. They're so minimal. And I was thinking, of course, because it's what I can carry, like underneath my arms to fairs. Like we couldn't afford to ship. And so it's just resulting of, like what we can do. And we have been facing, for example, last year we did Lista in Basel. And it was a point where it was a make or break. We knew that if we didn't sell any works, the project would be over. But as a friend says, sometimes you have to risk it to get the biscuit. So that's what we did.
And I guess for a while, I mean, we very actively did fairs for about, I think, a year and a half or so. We did Frieze London with Simone Subal Gallery. We did Nada in New York a couple of times and in Miami a couple of times. And Material in Mexico City. And that was actually very, let's say, for a particular conceptual and polemical reason, because the art fair booth, I think of it as an extension of the modernist trade fair booth, which is one of the forms and forums par excellence for the transmission of ideologies. It was what was used during the Cold War to kind of transmit ideologies, both socialist and capitalist, through goods and commodities. And so the display of those booths was very important. So we did a number of these presentations that often juxtaposed an older artist with a younger artist with some sort of like architectural display that was activated and created a kind of collaborative situation. But they are extremely expensive to do, and we decided not to do any art fairs for the next year to focus on the gallery program and also on a number of other things we're doing, like curating exhibitions for other nonprofits or groups at art fairs, or curating now with an artist named Mayan Strauss, a program called the Container Artist Residency, which is a residency program that will happen on commercial cargo ships throughout the world, and trying to focus on actually using these other forums rather than the kind of art fair per se as a way to communicate more broadly.
Excellent. So we're going to close it at that. Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Prem. Thank you very much.